Now, thank you. First thing we're going to have is an overview of the fall 2021 consensus revenue estimates, and we'll have J.G. Scott, Director of Legislative Research. J.G., welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick little brief overview. Sorry for everybody that's hearing this for the fourth time. But as always, do want to start with a little bit of context about where we were and how we got here. In April of 2021 now, the tax filing dates were delayed from April to May. Normally, when we are meeting in April for the April estimates, statutorily by April 20th, we are having some early receipts on balance due payments. We're getting some information on what refunds are and adjust everything accordingly. We didn't have that information. Even so, in the April estimates, we did raise the estimates by $320 million. So it was pretty substantial, about $45 million in income, about $125 million in corporate sales and use, also about $75 million. But when we finished the year, the receipts were above the estimates by about $766 million. You know, that's a substantial amount. About little over 500 million was in income tax, about 120 in corporate income, sales about 80, use about 40. So when we started the estimating process, you know, everybody knew that we were going to have to be increasing this a fair amount with a starting balance $766 million above what we were anticipated. When we sat down in November, we raised the estimates for the current year $1.3 billion above the April estimates. For 2023, we raised those about $178 million above the 22 estimate. What were some of the things that changed between April and November? We reopened the economy. We had some pent-up demand. There were people that had savings that were built up and were spending some of that. It generated really pretty strong growth, and underlying growth was pretty strong as well. Downside, we still looked at inflation, supply chain challenges, and then as Omicron has came to fruition, problems with COVID, so we still had those out year or those headwinds coming in. When we looked at the estimates that we did for our economic forecasts, inflation, we increased about 3%. We had it at about 2.2, raised that to 5.3. Real GDP, raised that about 1% from 4.7 to 5.7. And nominal Kansas GDP, we raised from about 4.2, about a 4.2% increase from about 6.9 to around 11%. And nominal GDP is how much it's actually rising. When we talk about real GDP, that's how much it's rising and subtracting out inflation. So those are the two. When we looked at the next year, inflation, we had dropping from 5.3% to 3.7. Real GDP from 5.7 down to 3.6. And nominal Kansas GDP from 11 down to 7.3%. So we're still continuing that increase, but at a much flatter rate. We looked at some employment numbers. In the February to April of 2020, we lost about 158,000 jobs. But then from April to September of 2020, we regained about 116,000, about a 74% recoupment rate. For unemployment, the projection was for 22 at 3.5% and 3.4% for 23 and 24. Looked at the agriculture economy, looked really pretty strong. Commodities prices, we're helping to stabilize that income. Still a fair amount of federal money coming in. For the oil and gas sector, Kansas crude oil, we forecasted at $65 a barrel, was at $49. And then for 23, we raised it from $49 to $63, a couple dollar a barrel drop. Natural gas, we have projected at $3.70 per MCF, and had that rate at $3.10 for 23. We're still seeing some difficulties in the manufacturing sector. We talked about growth doing well in employment. It's not doing as well in manufacturing. We've only replaced about 57% of those jobs, which is really impacting the Wichita area quite a bit. So if you go to the table, we'll just jump over there. Table 2 on page 10. This is a summary of the changes that were made between April and November for the current year. So when we look at individual income tax, raised at 18%, $671 million. Corporate up 112% at $317 million increase. But remember, nominal and real GDP both were increasing between those two estimates. Retail sales, we increased $184 million almost, and compensating use almost 95. And as GDP is going up, usually spending is going up, plus we also had the increase in inflation. All those going together, those are the largest increase, about $1.3 billion in total. And then when we look at table 1 on page 9, we can look at those changes between the 22 revised estimate and the 23 estimate. Individual income, we raised about $250 million. Corporate, we had drop about $65 million. Retail sales and compensating use between the two, we raised those about $110 million. So from that increase from the April estimate of about 17% from the April estimate to the revised estimate, 17% increase. The increase from 22 to 23 is leveled out at about 2%. So really did have everything flattening out on those projections going forward. Would you rather stop for questions or go ahead and go over the profile real quick?
Go ahead and do the profile, please.
Okay. So with new estimates comes a new profile. The profile that we have is on the last page. And this is absolutely accurate until Adam talks and it changes everything. So, but we did want to give everybody kind of a baseline of where we thought things were going to be with just some very basic increases. The actual expenditures and receipts for 21 left us with about a $2.1 billion ending balance. The approved moved forward that ending balance to the beginning balance, and we put in the consensus revenue estimates, about $8.9 billion. We have an approved budget of $1,143 million. There were $193 million in expenditures that were not made in 21 and moved forward into 22 with no legislative changes needed. That increased 22 by that $193 million. The human services caseloads dropped about $173 million. Most all of that was around the 6.2% FMAP rate increase. Federal government is paying 6.2% more for Medicaid. State is paying less. That saved the state some money. School finance, we reduced the estimate by about $90 million. And a lot of that was around the number of students that didn't come back into the classroom and were either in virtual or homeschooling or some outside. We have that then going back up in 23, but the ending balance for 22 is almost at $2.9 billion. Same process for 23. For expenditures, we put in the consensus revenue estimates. The beginning balance came up with almost $12 billion available to be spent. Expenditures, we just moved the expenditures that we had for the end of 22 for our starting point for 23, made minimal changes to that, took money away for the reappropriation, one-time expenditures. We added $170 million for human services caseloads and about $115 million for school finance. That brought the ending balance for 23 to almost $3.8 billion. So, stand for any questions if there are any.
Thank you, JG. Yes, we're going to take questions. A couple of them just right up front. You know, these numbers are tremendous and they look great. But if you could go back to 2008, 2009, did we have similar circumstances? Do you remember we had a large surplus and then like within a year, over $1 billion disappeared?
Yes, I mean we had some of those ending balances building up in 2008. They were about 500. Well, 2007 it was 935 million. In 2010, the ending balance was minus 27 million. So we had lost close to $600 million in that Great Recession.
And many things today are very similar. You know, inflation's even twice as bad, maybe 3 times as bad as it was in that period. You know, and oil and gas, I mean, you know, they're talking gas going to be $4 here by April. You know, our severance tax went from like $120 million to very little. Housing, look what's going on with housing today. Mm-hmm. You know, you get 3, 4, 5 offers. And stock market. I mean, I'm cautioning everyone here to remember that these dollars can disappear really, really quick. And, you know, got a lot of businesses with this shutdown for the mandates. A lot in my area, and particularly restaurants, they're not opening back up. They can't find help, you know, and we're talking about food. I mean, look at the empty shelves. I mean, we can talk about transportation and the bottlenecks or whatever, but, you know, a lot of truck drivers that don't get the shots aren't going to be able to work. I mean, we've got a lot of issues here, and I'm just cautioning people that, yes, we got a lot of money, and I know everybody in here has got a good idea on how to spend this, and I'm sure they're good ideas. But I just want to caution people that You know, these are balances we've never, ever seen, ever. We also have a lot of influence from the federal dollars. You know, those are showing up in here also. I'm from an ag community, and I'm here to tell you, you talk about inflation. Last year, fertilizer was $400 a ton. Today, you can't even buy it for $1,450 a ton. That's real inflation. Those ag revenues that we're looking at, we've got historic high commodity prices, but the input prices are looking very, very, very dim. So I just want to upfront let everybody know that we appreciate all the input and the ideas on how to get rid of all this money, but we cannot afford reckless spending. We can't. We got to be responsible. We need some ending balances. We need to have money for the future, and I think it's upon us to make sure that we do our best we can and make sure that we've got some cushion in case we have another 08 or 09.
Taking on that mantra, if you will, I would also caution people about adding a lot of expenditures or revenue, expenditure increases, revenue reductions. What got us into a lot of the trouble earlier was that we were always spending more money than we were bringing in, and then we had to have some adjustments on either spending or revenue to make those up. The more one-time changes we can implement in the current budget, the better off we'll be. And then I think we'll still have room to make some adjustments in both revenue and expenditures. But I think that, caution would be advised. And what we can do in 23 would make more sense, so that if something does happen between now and then, there's not a huge change that would have to happen. But yeah, I would agree. This does not project any type of major downturn in 23 or right now if we look forward going into the future. And there will be a correction. We just don't know how large or when.
Thank you, and I would tell the rest of the committee that the joint committee a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the same thing as JG just mentioned, one-time spends. Where can we put our dollars, pay off debt, things like that. So I encourage our committee members to keep these in mind, because anything that we put on that's going to continue down the road is going to be subject to trying to sustain that. And I know there's a lot of talk about cuts and rebates and giving money back to folks and everything else, but we got to be cautious. Questions? Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your comments about us being cautious and prudent. I have a question relative to LAVTR. Could I ask that, JG?
Yes.
I noticed you said that the assumption in the profile is not having that in there. That's still in statute.
It is in statute, but it was delayed in the last appropriation bill. So for the budget year for 2023, it's delayed in the fiscal year 2023 budget. You can change that, but that's why it was not included.
Could you refresh me on what are, if that were in there, in also the other two, the CCRS and the SCCHF, that city-county revenue sharing and the other one, what would that roughly be? It seems like it was about $130 to $160 million at one time.
I was thinking about 145, but that was when it had the cap on the local ad valorem at 54 million. That cap should be coming off sometime, and it'll increase that number as well.
So is there a chance I could get what that might be?
Not a problem.
Estimated. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the overview. Always appreciate the chance to look at the profiles that are there. And you gave the caveat that this is accurate until we look at the changes. And in particular, on the expenditure line item, I see it goes down ever so modestly as we move to 2023. Does that hold all salaries constant?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the only thing that changes between that 22 and 23 budget are just caseloads, the reappropriation, and school finance. Nothing else changed. That's pretty much a bare minimum budget.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to make sure as we get excited about the ending balance line that we realistically look at what is there. And appreciate the other pieces. On the revenue side, to Senator Billinger's point, there is modest growth that is projected to continue. And to the upside and downside, it seems the degree of change or the elasticity of our revenue to the change in the economy, it looked like we had pretty robust growth projected. And if those margins either are or aren't there, it would seem like we could have a fair amount of volatility either direction in those numbers. Do we have a sense of how elastic that is to respond to those changes in the economy?
I mean, what we looked at was the income tax is really trails pretty close to GDP. So if that Kansas GDP were to drop, which we did drop it, still increasing, but dropped it. If it were to drop more, we would expect income to drop, and also sales and use as well.
Representative Helgerson.
Thank you. JG, you and I have talked before. With the federal funds that have come in, you and Consensus have not been able to estimate how much at this point. And it is viewed that the federal funds that have come in are one-time money, and whether or not it's 10, 20, 30 billion. That has caused a dramatic increase in our revenues, or it's at least contributed to that. Consensus takes the position, though, that these are the funds that we have coming into our revenue are ongoing streams of revenue, not one-time revenue that's coming in. Is that correct?
I don't think that we would be projecting that all of the federal funds that were coming in for COVID would be ongoing. I would say that most of those expenditures have been geared towards one-time expenditures. So there's less of a relationship. We did have sales tax going up substantially because of the money and available revenue that people were getting. So we did have increasing sales tax, some 18-19% and dropping. But the increase in income tax is really around the withholding tax, which was really driving that up. And I think that's geared as much to some of the GDP expansion and inflation as well.
So the Consensus is taking the attitude that this is an ongoing regular stream in our revenue. It's not going to be a blip. It's going to be there for some period of time until we have some other event that occurs.
Right, and that's where the consensus process normally works forward. Is they're going to project in the out year what we think is going to happen, and then usually not anything as far as major changes go to those projections unless there's a major event that happens.
The one chart that would be helpful in the separate from the profile would also look at what the debt that the state has and the types of debt have changed. If that could be provided to the committee, that'd be very helpful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Representative Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee. JG, this is not something that you'll be surprised about, but since this pandemic started, we received increased FMAP of 6.2%. In round numbers, I think the last time I looked at it, it's around $500 million. Where is that reflected in our budget?
The consensus caseloads has calculated in what we believe those match rates are and where they're going, and then what we think we need to fill those in. So for 2022, I believe we have that calculated for 3 quarters. So in the fourth quarter of 22, we have that going back to the full state rate prior to the 6.2%. So a portion of that's replaced in those consensus numbers for 22. And then when we did the increase in 23, that's going in and putting a lot of the rest of that money back in for the full year. So it's putting that other 3 quarters in.
And I think I understand that. I think what I'm trying to understand is that we saved $500 million on our Medicaid expenditures over this pandemic. So would you actually say the budget is inflated by that $500 million because that's money that we saved?
I would say that the ending balances have gone up because of that $500 million, yes.
And that's what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Any other questions? Was there someone online that had a question?
Mr. Chairman, it's John Alcala. I do have a question for JD.
Go ahead, please.
I'm curious, when we talked about the GTP and on the economy law that's based on manufacturing expansion and jobs, being that there was federal money sent in which created the problem with some of these businesses being short of help, has that created a false positive in the GTP showing jobs creation?
I think that was part of the reason why it was able to go up, yes. Continuing on, I'm not sure how many of those that have now been, those jobs that have come back are going to be lost, because we're still projecting that unemployment around that 3.5, 3.4, 3.2% range. So we do think that helped bring those jobs back, but we don't think that necessarily they're going to go away just yet.
So it's kind of a, I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's kind of a shell game. It's hard to determine what we may lose, we may gain, then, right?
That was part of the difficulty that the consensus group had, was trying to figure out how much of what came from where. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, JG. Next, we'll have a briefing on the governor's budget. Adam Proffitt, Director of the Budget. Welcome to committee, Adam. Who's? Oh, he's online, okay. I was trying to figure out who was it. This is JR. Who's JR? Online, I guess. Oh, he's online. Does everyone have a copy? Looks like it. Yeah. Looks like whenever you're ready, Adam.
Thank you, Chairman Billinger and Chairman Waymaster. And before we get started, I just want to take a moment to say thank you both and to the committees for allowing me the opportunity to be here in front of both committees today at the same time. I certainly think it's helpful for me, but I think it's helpful for you folks as well to make sure that you're hearing the same message from me at the same time. So I appreciate the flexibility and the timing and the scheduling. Thank you very much for that. We are trying to get the presentation loaded online, but in the event of time, we've got a rather meaty presentation today. I anticipate will take quite some time. All right, we're in good shape here, so we'll go ahead and get started. So on page 2, you can see the agenda that we intend to cover today. I truly think that as we move through this presentation and you see the governor's budget recommendation, you're going to see a very comprehensive and complete budget. The budgeting process and putting it together this year was obviously a little bit different than the decisions that had to be made last year. We're in a much better position economically and fiscally. So the governor was able to put together truly a well-balanced budget. And when I say well-balanced, I don't just mean structurally balanced, which it is structurally balanced, but balanced in as much as there's a host of investments across the entirety of the portfolio. There's one-time investments, there's debt pay down, there's savings accounts, there's investing in core programs. There's a lot to get to with this budget in a very responsible and fiscally prudent manner. So on page 3 is just kind of a repeat of what JG had gone over. I won't spend any time on that. That's the latest consensus revenue estimate that was just reviewed. So if we move to page 4, I just want to talk about the key budget priorities that the governor had in mind as she was making budget decisions this year. So as many on this committee have already mentioned this morning, there's a thought that, and a strong thought, that many of the revenues that are in right now are one-time revenues. So therefore, the governor wanted to ensure that we were making one-time investments that would lead to long-term benefit without a long-term cost for the state. So take some of these one-time monies, one-time investments, long-term benefit for the state. Some examples I've got listed down below there. We can get into those in a little bit greater detail as we move through the presentation. Additionally, she wanted to ensure that since we are now in a position with the budget being stable and in a good spot moving forward, that she could provide meaningful and sustainable targeted tax relief across the entire state of Kansas to all citizens. And we'll talk about some of those pretty early in the presentation. One of the other priorities, and a very high priority, is something that we've been working on for the past several years, really. Over the past, 20, 30 years, there have been a lot of maneuvers done within the budgeting process due to revenue shortfalls at different points in time. There have been several recessions, there have been revenue shortfalls. So the budget team has had to go in the past and identify areas that we could kind of trick the budget, so to speak, to make it work. The goal is to completely eliminate all those maneuvers and get the budget back to just a standard budget where funding aligns with program source and the funding that belongs in one program stays there and goes forward. And we'll talk about some of those ideas here in just a moment. And then obviously making investments in the core programs and services that our citizens expect out of the government. So we'll touch on some of the key policy areas. I'll tell you right now that this presentation is going to be a little bit lighter on policy than what we've talked about in the past. We're going to focus a lot on the fiscal policy, if you will, some of the surplus spending and how we plan to park some of that money and make sure that we're investing it for long-term benefit for the state. So what you see in here is not the entirety of the governor's policy position, but just some of the highlights that we wanted to draw to the top as we move forward. So moving right ahead on slide 5 here, for those following along online, talking about providing nearly $1 billion in tax relief to Kansas citizens across fiscals 22 and 23. The governor has mentioned 2 of these proposals already, but I'll go into a little bit of detail here. So the first is the Axe the Food Sales Tax in Kansas. So it's been mentioned by many folks many times, when you combine state and local taxes, Kansas currently has the highest sales tax rate on food items in the nation. The plan here is to eliminate the state portion of the food sales tax effective 7/1/2023. We're very intentional with the words that it is a state portion only. There is no impact to the locals and their ability to assess taxes as they see fit in their communities. We're not eliminating the food tax. Instead, we are making the tax rate 0, which allows the locals to still implement tax policy at the local level as they need to. It's approximately a $450 million price tag to Kansas in fiscal 23, but there's a 1-month lag in revenues to the state, meaning the July revenues that we get in fiscal 23 will be from June sales, so it's only reflective of 11 months of cost to the state. As we move forward, it'll be closer to $495 million. So the Kansas citizen will get the entirety of that $495 million benefit in fiscal 23, but for the state, it's only a $450 million hit just due to timing. Governor is respectfully requesting that the legislature pass a clean, standalone food sales tax elimination bill early in session. And really, the reason for that is it takes a lot of work to get this into place. Department of Revenue has the resources to make sure they can get that done. Some of the big grocery players, the big box stores, they have the resources to ensure they can make their systems consistent with what the new tax policy will be. But some of the local mom and pops that operate 1 or 2 grocery stores in some of our rural communities, they're going to need some time to make sure that they can get up and running. And we'll have the support in place at the Department of Revenue to have phone calls and phone support to help them through. The earlier we pass this, the earlier we communicate it, the more time they have to make sure that they can get this implemented. Second tax policy that was unveiled recently was a one-time direct rebate, $250 to every resident tax filer in the state of Kansas, $500 for married filing jointly. Again, it's a one-time direct payment, thought being that with a current budget year surplus, return the money in a current budget year, not to impact the long-term sustainability of the budget or the revenue cycle. The fiscal note we have listed here is $460 million. Full transparency, I anticipate that number is going to come down a little bit. We looked at a 3-year average. It's been about $445 to $450 million. Tax year 20 had not yet closed out when we ran the fiscal note, so we increased the fiscal note, just to be safe, to $460, plus we have to cover administrative, mailing costs, things of that nature. As soon as we had the final number, we would lapse the balance of the SGF and just spend what we need to. The third one is a bit of a nuanced one. It's a vehicle modernization surcharge. So this is a surcharge that was put in place when you go renew your tags and taxes every year to assist with modernization of systems at the Division of Vehicles within Department of Revenue. That project was complete, and the surcharge should have fallen off, but we were in a tough revenue position, so that revenue stream stayed on the books, and it's been funding the highway fund and a couple of other programs over the past several years. The governor is proposing to eliminate that surcharge since it's fulfilled its intended obligation and replace programs with SGF funding. That is about a $12.5 million fiscal note. We'll talk about the details of that a little bit later. Looks like I'm losing my clicker here, but that's okay. We'll just move on ahead to page 6 here. So moving on to one-time investments. Governor is proposing strategically investing $2.4 billion across fiscal years 22 and 23 in one-time investments. Again, this avoids starting projects that come with a funding commitment in the out years. I've got each of the line items broken out here on the big table on the left and the dollar amount in the fiscal year that they would be in. And on the bottom right, again, they're on page 6. Inside that orange box, we have kind of the major categories of funding. So you can see rainy day fund, tax relief, some debt pay down, debt avoidance, on-time payments. That is not a typo. It's not supposed to say one time. It's on-time payments, economic development, and then other. And we'll talk about some of these in subsequent slides. So the first area of one-time investment is depositing $600 million into the Budget Stabilization Fund. You can see at the top there that Kansas is currently one of 2 states in the nation that is reporting a 0 balance in our Budget Stabilization Fund. You'll recall as part of the GBR last year during the allotment plan from 2020, the plan was to pull the Budget Stabilization Fund into the SGF. Through session, that just kind of left it stayed in the budget bill at the end of the year, so we pulled that $81 million back to the SGF, so the current balance is 0. I've got 2 graphs here that show 2 different ways of looking how a state can measure the adequacy of their Budget Stabilization Fund. On the top, you can see a measure of the Budget Stabilization Fund as it relates to percent of expenditures. The national average, which is the blue line there, is 11.9%. So on average, states carry about 11.9% of their expenditures in their Budget Stabilization Fund. That is up from pre-pandemic levels where it was 7.9%. So some states have used this one-time money to increase their rainy day fund. Should Kansas make the $600 million deposit, that would make our percent of expenditures 6.7% in our rainy day fund, so consistent or at least closer to where the national average was. On the bottom, we talk about days of cash on hand in the rainy day fund. What this measures is if all revenues stop coming into the state, how many days can you operate the state general fund just with a rainy day fund? You can see on that chart there that the national average is about 30 days cash on hand in the rainy day fund. Each of our neighboring states, with the exception of one who's just barely below this, is above 20 days. When Kansas had $82 million in there, we had 4 days cash on hand. So by depositing $600 million into the budget stabilization fund, we'll have about 25 days of cash on hand in the rainy day fund, which gets us much more closely aligned with our neighboring states. Okay, slides 9 and 10, 8 and 9, we are going to talk about debt retirement and debt avoidance. So on page 8, you can see at the top, the governor is proposing retiring $586 million of debt early, which will lead to $252 million of savings and interest costs, all in SGF. There are 3 items that she is proposing to pay off early. I'm going to work backwards from how they're listed on this page here. So the bottom 2 items are 2 bonds that have a call date in fiscal 23. We've run this past KDFA. They've done a refunding scan across all the bonds that we carry that are SGF supported, and they've identified these 2 bonds as 2 that make fiscal sense for us to go ahead and call and pay off early based on the provisions of the call. So the bottom one there is just a refunding bond. It has a whole host of old refundings in it. It's got the John Redmond Reservoir. It's got a KU Med health education building and some other items in it. That current payoff there is about $161 million. That saves $25.9 million of interest costs over the balance of the life, and it frees up $27.8 million of SGF in fiscal 23 that would have otherwise gone to debt service. The one right above that is the bond for the balance of the NBAF facility. Again, the current payoff on that one is $171.8 million. That will save us $54 million of SGF against the original payment schedule, and it frees up $17 million that would have otherwise gone to debt service in fiscal 23. Then on the top there, I want to talk about capers and the layering payment. So you'll recall in fiscal 17 and fiscal 19, the state skipped some of its portions of the capers payment, and we agreed to I think it was a 20-year payback. They're called layering payments that go on top of our regular payment to make caper whole over a period of 20 years. The current balance on that is $253.8 million. If we pay that off right now, the state will save $172 million of SGF over the next 14 years. So again, pay $253 million, save $172 million. That's $25.8 million of SGF that'll be freed up next year. This is different than a deposit into the capers system. So there's an extraordinary deposit that some people talk about, and then there's this layering payment. This is completely different because this is 100% SGF. If you do an extraordinary deposit into capers, there's a blend of SGF, federal funds, fee funds, other items, so the savings is not pure SGF. This one is paid purely with SGF, so all the savings and the SGF, the money that's freed up is all SGF. Additionally, it's a debt that we owe to capers carried at an interest rate of 7.75%, so an extremely high interest rate. The way capers reflects this on the books right now is they do show it as an asset, but it's a receivable. What this will do is convert that receivable into cash that capers can then invest into their portfolio. So last year, the capers plan had a 26% return, $253 million in the plan at a 26% return is about $60 million of additional cash that could be flowed into the caper system and compounded over time. Moving on to page 9, this is where we start talking about debt avoidance. So the governor is proposing using the current budget surplus to pay cash for 4 capital projects in fiscal 23. So the first 2 are listed in that first bullet. That's the docking building and the KDHE lab. Both of these were approved by the State Finance Council on 12/17 of 21. And both of them in last year's budget bill came with the authority to bond at $120 million worth of bond authority for docking and $65 million worth of bond authority for KDHE. The governor is proposing putting SGF into the budget, paying cash for those. The next one is the State Defense Building Remodel. And this is a new project that is not yet approved, but one that the Adjutant General has been talking about for quite some time, and one that is desperately needed. I was fortunate enough to take a tour of that building over the summer. and it's a very old and antiquated building, and it no longer suits the needs of the Division of Emergency Management and all the other things that that division and that operation does. So it'll be a $21 million price tag to upgrade that building. The third bullet there is for a new Hayes Armory. The current facility in Hayes, Kansas is over 60 years old. Again, it no longer supports the needs of the troop that's out there. So the Adjutant General is requesting acquisition of land and construction of a new building to better support their needs. That comes at a price tag of $18.1 million. All told, this is $224 million that in a normal year would have been bonded that we can pay cash for. I ran a very quick, very elementary amortization schedule on what a 30-year bond would cost. Call it 3% level pay, 30-year bond at $224 million. The interest cost on that would have been $118 million over the course of 30 years. So by paying cash, we can avoid $118 million of interest cost. Now, I will caveat this, that we have given instruction to the agencies that they still need to go look for federal dollars to offset the state's cost of these facilities. We do think there's federal funding available to help with each of these projects. So once we identify the exact level of federal funding that's available, the governor will submit a GBA to reduce the SGF in there to make sure that it's whole, but federal dollars in SGF, not just SGF. All right, so slides 10 and 11, this is another, we're getting into what we call budget maneuvering. You know, these are some of the things that we had to do as a budget office over many, many years to ensure that we had healthy ending balances and could make it through some of the budget crunches of recessions past. The first one is pulling forward the delayed K-12 payment. This practice started all the way back in 2003 and has just stayed in place ever since then. So in effect, what we do is with the final payment to K-12 every year that's supposed to be paid in June, we pay about half of it in June, and the other half we pay in July. What that does for the state is it allows us to recognize that as a July expense, therefore it doesn't impact our ending balance, but we tell the schools, you must recognize that as a June revenue, so it looks like the state met its full obligation in the fiscal year in which we were supposed to. This is candidly an accounting maneuver that we probably shouldn't be doing. It's not real wise accounting, so this would clean up the accounting. It would also free up the districts from getting an audit finding every year on their books when they get questioned on why did you recognize the July revenue as a June revenue. It cleans that up. Many of the districts don't have the cash flow to bridge that gap from a June payment to a July payment, so it's going to help their cash flow, and it's going to help the state's cash flow. So if we maintain a 7.5% ending balance as a starting point, right now that ending balance is automatically overstated by $200 million because we know we have that $200 million payment coming in 2 days. So what that does is it makes the July percent of total year's expenditures higher than it should be. If we pull this back into June, A, we're doing clean accounting, B, we're helping the school's finances, C, we're pushing a state expense out into June instead of being in July, which really reduces the need for a certificate of indebtedness that we've carried, with the exception of this year, every year for the past 20 years, because that payment obligation is now going to come after the revenue peak in April. So on slide 11 here, I'll do my very best to see how the mechanics work. So if you can kind of bear with me, it's confusing even to me, so I'll probably say it wrong. There'll be a lot of questions afterwards, and that's just fine. So what we have on the left are two tables, and they're both the way we do things currently. And I'm showing 2 fiscal years, fiscal year 22 on the top, fiscal year 23 on the bottom. So you can see that in fiscal year 22, for example, in July, we make a current year payment of $394 million as an example. But we also make a delayed payment from the previous year of about $200 million. So our total July payment is $593 million. Then in August and September and October and all the other months through May, we make the regular current year payment and no delayed payments. We get to June and all we do is make a half payment for the current year and no delayed payment. Then fiscal 23, again, we make our current year payment in July of $394 million plus the delayed payment from the previous year. So again, our July payments are inflated. Slide out to the right, and this is what the governor is proposing. And you can see that with the orange arrow, we would take that delayed payment and move it up to June under the current payment column. So now in June, instead of paying $194 million, we're going to pay $394 million, all on-time payments. There will be no delayed payment. If you slide down to July, everything is going to be on time. So the way this works, it's effectively a 13th payment for schools for this current fiscal year, but everything going forward is just 12 on-time payments in the month that they're supposed to be paid. And I didn't see anybody fall asleep, so I think we're okay. So on slide 12, again, some other budget maneuvers that we had to do was find sources for funding for programs that were not in the SGF because the SGF could not support these programs at various points in time in the past. So the governor is proposing to pull all the programs to align them with their funding source, meaning if a program should be funded by SGF, let's move the funding back into SGF and free up the other funding source for its intended purpose. The first one is the highway fund. So the governor is proposing eliminating all extraordinary transfers from the highway fund to the state general fund. We'll get into what that means on the next page. Second bullet there, the governor is also proposing to end all extraordinary transfers from the EDIF into the SGIF. And I'll give you some numbers behind what that means here in a couple of slides as well. The third one, we talked about eliminating the vehicle modernization surcharge. I'll talk about some of those on the next slide. And then the CIF, the Children's Initiative Fund, there are a few programs that are funded out of this that really belong in an agency. So for example, there's some mental health money that the CIF sends to KDADs. Instead, we will now send SGF to KDADs to make sure that program keeps going, but it frees up CIF money to stay within the Children's Cabinet. The Children's Cabinet did a very comprehensive study this year on what they would be able to accomplish if they were able to keep the entirety of what they're supposed to in the CIF. And this allows them to move forward with that plan that their board approved over the summer. So we move forward to slide 13 here. We'll talk about the Bank of KDOT. So the governor has talked about many times over the past couple of years, and she reminded emphatically last night that the Bank of KDOT is closing in fiscal 23. So you can see here on the bottom left, I've got the table of transfers from the highway fund to the SGF going all the way back to fiscal year 2010. If you total up all those transfers, that's $2.3 billion that has come out of the highway fund to go to the SGF to cover general operating expenditures. The impact of that is we're not able to get to all of the infrastructure projects that we've committed to, either under the previous transportation plan or the current IKE plan. So by freeing up all those highway funds to stay with the highway program, we can get to these IKE programs a bit more quickly, and we can start to really work against infrastructure in the state. On the bottom right, there's a table that shows the other extraordinary transfers that have been coming out of the highway fund to cover other areas of state debt and state programs that we're going to realign. So you can see there's a transfer to KDADs, again, for mental health grants of $9.7 million that the highway fund has been sending to KDADs. We will now send KDADs $9.7 million of SGF to make sure that program stays whole, but it's funded with SGF instead of the highway fund. There's $320,000 that goes to the Adjutant General. They will now get $320,000 of SGF to ensure their program is whole, but it's funded with SGF. And there's $15.8 million of debt service for general state bond obligations that's been funded by the highway fund. We're going to shift that funding to the SGF, so it's funded by SGF and not the highway fund. We talked earlier about the DMV surcharge, that $4 surcharge. $10 million of that was going to the highway fund. That just goes away. But if you net the impact of all the other moves out of the highway fund against that $10 million, it's still a positive $15.9 million that the highway fund has available to complete their infrastructure projects. So you add that $15.9 million plus the close of the Bank of KDOT of $66 million, we've got well over $80 million of incremental funding for the highway fund in fiscal 23. More than $80 million. Yeah. Okay, moving on to page 14. Again, prior budget stresses have caused us to cut funding greatly or completely eliminate funding to the State Water Plan Fund. As the governor announced last night, she plans to fully fund the State Water Plan Fund at the full statutory levels for for the first time since fiscal year 2008. This is $6 million out of the SGF and $2 million out of the EDIF, as is defined in statute. That's a 39% increase to the State Water Plan Fund. This is going to impact the Water Office, Department of Agriculture, KDHE, and others. It really, really invests in the state's future water and protects our agricultural health. Okay. We'll go ahead and move forward into some of the policy discussion. We'll start with K-12. On page 15, again, no surprise here. Governor is proposing fully funding K-12 education. Happy to report that fiscal year 23 becomes the final year of the incremental adjustments to the base level of funding. Everything beyond fiscal 23 will be tied to the CPIU Midwest, as was agreed to in the Gannon settlement. There's been a strong partnership with the legislature and the governor over the past several years to ensure that we protected K-12 funding. She's happy to be able to partner with the legislature again to be able to protect the funding for this critical program as well. One item of note, she is proposing to go ahead and put the fiscal year 24 appropriation for K-12 in this year's budget bill, just to make sure that there's consistency and it's out there for the future and there's no questions about it as we move forward. On top of fully funding the base level, there are additional enhancements that are going to go into K-12 to help our students and our teachers. $1.8 million for professional development aid as requested by Department of Education. $1.5 million for CTE transportation aid. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. $360,000 for some national board certification. $100,000 for the statewide dyslexia coordinator is going into this budget for fiscal 23. And $3 million to expand the mental health intervention team pilot program. I don't think it's a pilot anymore. Now it's just a program. But the $3 million to go to the mental health intervention team is going to allow it to expand to additional school districts to ensure that we're hitting that benefit across more districts to the state. And again, eliminating the delayed payment. I want to make sure it's clear because when you see the table on the next page, it's going to look like a $200 million increase in K-12 funding in fiscal 22. That's strictly due to eliminating that delayed payment. It's not incremental funding to K-12. So if we move forward to page 17, we'll start talking about post-secondary education. Post-secondary education has taken a few hits over the years and their funding went backwards. So the governor is proposing making a very, very substantial investment in post-secondary education across all types of post-secondary education. 2 years, technicals, 4 years, cybersecurity, also need-based grant application for student aid. This will represent the largest single year-over-year increase for post-secondary education in the history of this program. So as was mentioned last night, the governor is proposing $45.7 million to the 4 years to restore their funding to pre-pandemic levels and ensure that they freeze tuition for another year. You can see in this table below what the tuition increases have been year over year. As we started increasing the funding for the 4 years in fiscal year 2020, they've been able to implement more and more tuition freezes. Fiscal 23 will represent another freeze in tuition for the 4-year universities. Additionally, $25 million for an Access Kansas partnership grant. This is a public-private partnership. It's going to be matched dollar for dollar. So a $25 million state investment will be matched by $25 million of private money for a $50 million pot of money to go to need-based application to offset the cost of 4-year universities for Kansas residents. It'll be application-based. It'll be housed with Board of Regents, and there will be criteria under which folks will have to submit the application. By freezing tuition and ensuring that there's $50 million of available funding to offset the cost, this is going to make post-secondary education more accessible to more Kansas families, which is only going to increase our workforce capacity in the coming years. So we move forward to slide 18, talk about making investments in the 2 years in the technical university or colleges. So $15 million of one-time SGF to be distributed across a system of 2 years. This is for programs that they have identified that they can do with one-time funding, student recruitment, program development for in-demand career fields, making sure that students are getting the education they need to the 2 years in technicals. $6 million to fund the state share of tiered and non-tiered. That'd be $2 million for the tiered and $4 million for the non-tiered. Also, $2.5 million of incremental funding for the Excel and CTE program. This should fully fund the cost of the Excel and CTE program. If you take this $2.5 million for the program itself and you add the $1.5 million that went to K-12 for transportation to get these kids to the programs, that's a $4 million investment in the Excel and CTE program for fiscal year 23. So keep talking about the workforce and shift gears a little bit to the economy and the workforce and the work that's going on at the Department of Commerce on slide 19 here. Again, the governor is proposing to eliminate the extraordinary transfer from the EDIF into the SGF. There's been a transfer from the EDIF into the SGF every year since fiscal year 14. That was the last time that we didn't have a transfer from EDIF into SGF. During that time, it's been $152.8 million of EDIF money that went to cover SGF expenditures. By leaving these funds within the Department of Commerce at the EDIF, it allows this fund to be fully funded. It's an incremental $15 million to go towards its intended purpose of growing business in Kansas and growing the workforce in Kansas. You can see the results that the Department of Commerce has had in Kansas since fiscal year 19, and they can continue to have some success there. Pardon me. Additionally, the governor is providing $2 million of an enhancement to the KIT and KER project, the industrial training and industrial retraining to assist businesses with the education programs. And then $2.2 million for additional programs aimed at small businesses and student apprenticeship programs to make sure that students are better prepared to enter the workforce. The big one at the bottom, this is a one-time expenditure, $20 million for moderate income housing. There was a housing needs assessment that was recently completed and identified a very dire shortage of affordable housing across the state. This $20 million investment is going to allow us to make a strong investment in making housing more affordable and providing more options across the state of Kansas, not just in the current communities that current program goes to. This is obviously good for Kansas to have more affordable housing. And it's also a workforce development tool. There's been a lot of new jobs created in Kansas, so we need to ensure that we have housing to fit all those bodies that are going to be coming to the state. Moving forward to slide 20, talk about meeting our residents where they are to take care of their mental health service needs. So a strong investments in KDADs and the state hospitals, $29 million to increase mental health services all across the state. And that's a blend of funding, certainly some to go to the state hospitals and increase their bed capacity in some of the programs that are happening at the regional state hospitals, but also for KDADs to work with community partners across different regions to ensure that we have regional partnerships to increase bed capacity on the private side as well. Also funding for community crisis intervention centers and suicide prevention grants. We talked about the $3 million for the mental health intervention team pilot that actually sits with K-12, but it's another mental health service and investment there. Continuing the projects that we talked about last year at the Lansing and Winfield correctional facilities. Winfield, the focus being more on the geriatric population and make sure those folks are taken care of. Lansing, it's really about substance use disorder, and that program is designed to ensure a more successful reintegration into society upon release, which is going to reduce recidivism and certainly cost to the state. And in the state hospitals, there's a host of funding there, behavioral crisis stabilization at Parsons, some security enhancements at Larned, and then $2.4 million to OSH to support lifting the moratorium and then adding a social detox program there. Along the same lines, there's some investments in the Can Care program. Most of these are focused on the waiver population. So KDADs did a deep dive and saw that for personal care service rates, the PCS services, the rates varied depending on which waiver a resident might be on. So they're putting forward a proposal to standardize the PCS rates across all waiver types. So as folks transition from waiver to waiver, or as PCS potential pool of employees is looking for employment, it doesn't matter which waiver they go to, they can expect the same reimbursement rate. Additionally, there's a small enhancement to the rates. So once we stabilize those rates across all of the waivers, provide a 2% increase in the waiver rates for those. Also, taking the private duty nursing rate for the IDD waiver to $43 an hour. Recently, this particular reimbursement code went to $43 for the TA waiver, but it did not get captured in the IDD waiver, so making sure there's consistency across those two waivers for that same service. Increase in lifetime cap on assistive services to $10,000. This hits a variety of waivers, the FE, BI, PD, and IDD waivers. The current lifetime cap is at $7,500 and has not been increased in over 2 decades. So time to recognize that, we're 2 decades ahead in terms of cost of living, so make it $10,000. And you can see here some of the things that it goes to fund with vehicle modifications, home modifications, durable metal equipment, things of that nature. And the bottom bullet is extending the coverage for pregnant women on Medicaid to 12 months postpartum. Current Medicaid policy ends coverage for pregnant women at 60 days after giving birth. That is a time that is very critical to continue receiving physical health care and getting mental health services. So this small investment is going to extend that coverage all the way to 12 months. Many states are doing this. This is newly allowable under the federal regulations, and excited to be able to partake in this. Staying with care, Governor is again proposing expanding Medicaid to the full eligible adult expansion population beginning 1/1 of 23. If I can draw your attention to the map at the very bottom, this is a map of the states that have and have not yet expanded Medicaid. States in blue have expanded Medicaid and implemented, states in orange have not. You'll notice that Kansas is orange, meaning we have not yet expanded, but literally every single state that shares a border with Kansas is now blue. In years past, there was concerns that should Kansas expand before our neighboring states, we might see an influx of folks trying to take advantage of Medicaid expansion here in Kansas. Now the concern is by Kansas not expanding, there could be an out-migration of providers to surrounding states that do cover Medicaid patients and reimburse for the services that are being provided. Additionally, with the American Rescue Plan Act, the federal government is providing for non-expansion states, should they implement Medicaid expansion, they receive 8 quarters of enhanced FMAP of 5 percentage points on the base Medicaid population, not the expansion population, but the larger base Medicaid population. That goes on for 8 quarters. We anticipate the savings on that over those 8 quarters to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $370 to $450 million. For the sake of being conservative, we went with the lower estimate of $370 million. And again, that's a quarterly draw, so you get that money saved for 8 quarters. It's not one lump sum that comes in at one point in time. But the net effect of that is each of the Medicaid expansion fiscal notes that we put forward in the past couple of years have shown an initial cost of $19 million in the first year if it's for 6 months, and about $40 million a year if it's for a full 12 months. So if we assume 6 months of Medicaid expansion in Kansas and that cost of $19 million, we would get $86 million of additional federal money from this 5 percentage point FMAP. So the state would actually save $68 million of SGF by expanding Medicaid in fiscal 23. That savings grows in fiscal 24 substantially. And again, there's savings in fiscal 25 by way of that 5 percentage point enhancement to the FMAP. Clearly, at some point, that goes away, and there is a cost for the state to operate the program. But that cost is 4 to 5 cents on the dollar of the total investment, meaning the state cost is approximately $40 to $45 million for a $1 billion program. $40 to $45 million of SGF for a $1 billion program. That also does not take into account any of the increased revenues that might come by way of increased employment, also saving hospitals in rural Kansas, and having a healthier workforce to be able to go out there. Shifting gears into law enforcement, Governor is proposing $18.1 million of SGF to upgrade the Kansas Highway Patrol air fleet. Highway Patrol currently has a fleet that is old. I joke, but it's not a joke. One of their airplanes is 1 year older than I am, so I would be terrified to get on that because I know how my body feels. They are also the only law enforcement agency in the state that has air support unit. So it's not just doing highway patrol work, but they're helping the locals as well respond to emergencies and apprehension and other items. So they're spread pretty thin with the antiquated fleet that they have right now. This is an opportunity to use current surplus to fund this, make the upgrade necessary. Also proposing a pay enhancement for KHP troopers and local law enforcement officers to assist with recruitment and retention, really making substantial increases in the starting pay for trooper trainees. Restoring $1.1 million to the KBI from the reduced resource package from the previous year, making sure they have full funding going forward to do the important work that they do. And then $800,000 to Wildlife and Parks law enforcement for body cameras and records management data systems. Staying with public safety, investing in recruitment and retention. And this will be mostly specific to Department of Corrections. And it's a multi-pronged approach to ensure that we have a strong recruitment and retention package to keep these valuable employees. So there's been a lot of talk about the 24/7 pay plan. You may or may not have heard about it, but the governor announces we've implemented it. We got federal funding. Thank you to the State Finance Council for approving that to cover the costs in fiscal year 22. In fiscal year 23, the governor is proposing SGF to fully fund this, both the base pay increase and the 4 temporary differentials that were layered on top of that all the way through fiscal 23. Again, the goal would to be not to use all 4 of those differentials. They are temporary in nature. We would want them to roll off, but want to make sure the funding is there to cover it for fiscal 23 should the need arise. Also providing money to Department of Corrections to fund uniform upgrades and equipment upgrades, purchase a new stab vest for every single corrections officer, also new uniforms for the corrections officers, and then $2.5 million for vehicle replacement. And on both the equipment replacement and the vehicle replacement, we're developing a strategic long-term plan of how we can upgrade parts of those fleets over time instead of just making a large chunk of investment at one point in time and having the same problem, 5-10 years down the road. Also, the governor is proposing moving the corrections officers and the like, Wildlife and Parks and the juvenile corrections officers off of CAPERS and into KPNF. Staying in the theme of recruitment and retention, the governor is proposing a 5% statewide salary increase for all state employees. State employees have only received 3 statewide increases since fiscal 2012. During that same time, they have seen an increase in the employee contribution to the health plan, meaning their health plan costs have gone up 6 times. So they got a pay increase 3 times, but their cost to have health insurance went up 6 times during that same time frame. 1 year went up by as much as 30%. So the net effect in years like that is that the take-home pay actually goes down for state employees. Governor's proposed 2.5% each of the last couple of years. We haven't been able to get there the last couple of years. That's where this 5% number comes from to ensure that A, it's staying up with inflation, but B, making up for lost time. This does apply to the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Apologies to the committee, it excludes elected officials. It also excludes the KHP troopers as they're getting their own pay plan. And then the schools for the blind and deaf, those teachers have their own pay plan by statute, so they're excluded from this as well. Everybody else gets that 5%. So mercifully, we are coming towards the end here, but I want to make sure that we review the budget priorities. So again, just continue investing in critical areas of need. No matter where the budget is at, whether it's a good year or a bad year, we need to ensure that we're sitting down and really reviewing each of the programs and what the benefit is to the citizens. And the governor took a hard look at these and wanted to make sure that we protected core funding or core services and the funding for it. Providing targeted, meaningful, and sustainable tax relief, making sure that there's no impact to future budgets so that we can sustain that, because the current AXA food tax sales plan calls for no other tax increases and no other offsets and expenditures. It is self-funded through time. Also continuing to stabilize the budget. There was a lot of budget maneuvers that we talked about that we're going to undo in here. So if we can get this passed and implemented in this fashion, as we move into next year's budget presentation, we should be looking at a clean budget where everything is where it's supposed to be. We could just talk about policy and what the decisions are on that front. A review of fiscal 22's expenditures, again, focusing on strategic one-time investments to provide long-term benefit to the state. You can see on the bottom right there, the category of one-time expenditures. It totals $1.9 billion in fiscal 22. You can see some of the line item detail on the left over there. Page 28 is fiscal 23. Key here is that the budget remains balanced. It remains structurally balanced. So if you exclude the one-time expenditures from this profile, revenues exceed expenditures by $213 million. That is structural balance, at least as to sustainable budgeting. The ending cash balance is strong. We're ending the year with $671 million of SGF, which is at the 7.5% level. And then also the $600 million in the Budget Stabilization Fund. You add those two together, you're at 14.3% of expenditures sitting with cash on hand at the end of the fiscal year. And again, you can see the one-time expenditures down at the bottom of the page, a little bit lower in fiscal 23, $479 million, but we got to a lot of those earlier. And on page 29, you can see our profile again. It just kind of rehashes and reformats everything we've already talked about. Key numbers on the far right is fiscal 23. You can see our beginning balance, and then the revenues. Down in the bottom half, you see the expenditures and our ending balance in percents. And with that, Mr. Chair, it looks like I did a terrible time of running out the clock, so I have time for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Adam. Very good presentation. A couple of things. First off, thank you, because you've been to several of our budget meetings. You took really good notes, because there's only a few things that you didn't put in here that we had suggested through our budget committee, so thank you. I'm glad you was taking good notes.
I must have stepped out for lunch on the others.
I'll discuss them with you later. One of the questions I had on these transfers out of Kansas Department of Transportation, there's a transfer in there for school bus transportation or something. Did we eliminate that? I mean, it wasn't in your sheet here. It's just.
I'm not familiar with what you're talking about off the top of my head. My team right behind me will write that down. We'll look and see what that is. Let me make clear, the transfers that we are eliminating are extraordinary transfers. There are still transfers from the highway fund, right? So the highway fund funds a lot of the highway patrol. Highway patrol is part and parcel of the highway system. So that's a normal transfer. It's the extraordinary transfers that we focused on.
Okay, so that one's probably still in there, okay. Mm-hmm. Another question is, $20 million for housing. I think everyone in here has discussed housing, and we all know, but, you know, with this inflation that's hit, you know, you could buy a half-inch sheet of wafer board for $7.50, and today it's like 40-some bucks. So this doesn't seem like a lot. How's this going to work? I mean, $20 million for affordable housing.
Yeah, I don't know the details. If you're asking how many houses that would purchase or where it would go, those answers are yet to be, those questions are yet to be answered. The funding is going to go to the Department of Commerce, and they have partnerships with groups that specialize in this. I think Kansas Housing Resource Commission, right? That's a group that specializes in this and could put together a plan. I don't know how far that's going to go. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that $20 million is going to completely eliminate the shortage of housing in Kansas, but I think it's a great first step. And if there's discussions that you want to have on increasing that, I'm certain that folks would be open to listening.
Thank you. Representative Waymaster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Profit, you know that for many years I've been an advocate for putting money into the Budget Stabilization Fund, also known as the Rainy Day Fund. And so in the governor's budget, she has $600 million that's going to be invested into that particular account based off of 25 days cash on hand. If we would do, I was doing some rough math while you were speaking, so if we would do what our surrounding states, which you said with the exception of one, who actually is under 20 days, would that be about $480 million for 20 days cash on hand?
Well, so let me clarify. I was saying they're all above 20 days, not at 20 days.
Okay.
So if you look at the graph on the left, your math is right to answer your first question, yes.
Right.
If you look at the graph on the left, you can actually see some of the surrounding states. And it's an unfortunate color scheme because they're all very similar. But the one that looks like a W and it's real high, that's Nebraska. They're actually at around 30 days. And then Missouri is the kind of light blue. They're at about 21, 22 days right now. So they'd be a little bit below the 25 that we'll be at.
Okay, well, I was just kind of going through the math there, because we're only seeing an infusion of those dollars into the Budget Stabilization Fund in '22. There's nothing beyond that, correct?
There's no transfer in fiscal, no extraordinary transfer for fiscal '23. You know this probably better than I do, but there is a formula in statute that dictates how much would go into it if there's a surplus. We're not touching that formula, so if the revenues exceed the final revenue estimate, that would still go in there at the end of fiscal '22 and '23.
If we would not negate that statute in
Correct.
the budget.
Yeah.
Okay. In regards to EDIF, which is the transfer that goes from EDIF, or the Economic Development Initiatives Fund, into the State General Fund, you are having that approximate $15 million go to the Department of Commerce directly?
Staying with the EDIF.
Oh, just staying with EDIF?
Yeah, I just
So
think
not
Commerce
being directed to the Department of Commerce?
stays in EDIF to allow Commerce to do what they do with that fund.
Okay, in your presentation, I had taken it as that was going to be a transfer to Department of Commerce with no guideline or stipulation on how that money would be spent.
My apologies. It
Okay.
stays with EDIF, and it follows statutes that govern EDIF, as was discovered in the LPA audit from several years ago.
Well, that clears that up. And then yesterday, we had before the State of the State speech in the afternoon, we had the State of the Judiciary, and they had actually made a proposal in their budget to ease them from relying on the fees that are generated for the judicial branch to fund part of the judicial branch, have those deposited into the State General Fund, and then having the State General Fund making an allocation back to the judicial branch. Is that part of the governor's budget submission?
It is. By statute, we have to treat the judicial branch budget as a pass-through. So we reflect all of their recommendations in our budget and then pass it on to the legislature. So that impact is reflected here.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next, we have Representative Hoffman. Yeah, I've got her now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, on page 6, there is a Commerce KBOR matching grant. Did you talk about that? I didn't ever see that, what that 195 million is.
Yep. I did not talk about that, thank you. I couldn't get to everything. So that is it's a new grant. It's another public-private partnership grant that's going to go to the four-year universities, $195 million. It's got to be matched dollar for dollar with new private money by the university. So they can't use existing endowments or other institutional funds. They need to go out and raise new monies. And it's going to be geared, the money's actually going to go to the Department of Commerce, but it's going to be specific for the four-year universities. And they'll have to submit an application to Department of Commerce that is showing an economic development project that has long-term great benefit to the state for a need that is immediate right now. So it'll provide long-term increase in the tax base, if you will, generate new revenue. There's going to be criteria around that.
Next, we have Representative Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A comment and two quick questions. First of all, thank you very much. For the first time in 4 years, we're not attempting to re-amortize capers, and that's a great benefit to the many people that rely on that. Secondly, last year during the budget process, the governor recommended $42 million be swept from the Juvenile Justice Fund, of which ended up being $21 million ultimately swept. Does her budget recommend returning that $21 million back to the Juvenile Justice Fund?
It does. Thank you for asking the question. That's another one on the one-time funding page. It's on there, and I just didn't get to it. I apologize. But if you go to the one-time expenditure page, again on page 6, you'll see about a third of the way down on fiscal 22, restoring the evidence-based program, $21 million. I will give full transparency here. There's going to be proviso language on there to fund JAG-K at a level of $3.5 million out of that fund. It's proven to be evidence-based, and it's getting ahead of justice-involved youth and kind of redirecting before that. But yes, full restoration to that fund.
Great, thank you very much. Final question for me. Define food. Are we including anything that we eat, anything that we drink? And does she specify what that looks like?
Yeah, so I'll tell you that the two bills are ready to go. I believe they'll be introduced shortly, I don't know, but the RS is out there so you can read through it. It's food and food ingredients. So to answer shortly, if you're buying tomato sauce, cheese, and crust from the grocery store, that's exempt from taxes. If you're buying a already prepared pizza, that is not exempt from the 6.5% tax. So it doesn't include restaurants, it's grocery and grocery items on the food side.
Okay, anything on the drink side?
Yeah, soda would be included, does not include alcoholic beverages, those would still be taxed. Soda would be exempt from the tax, bottled water.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next, we have Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the overview. Appreciate that, and some things that we may not agree on, but a number that we do. So to the governor's points made in the speech last night, I look forward to having policy-focused discussions where we can move Kansas forward, and thank you for getting those started. On the debt reduction, agree with the comments on CAPERS, and particularly the payoff of the layered payments that were there. I think the chair had spoken to that also for the reasons that you said. I think that is an important first step. Perhaps there are further steps on CAPERS. For my colleagues, I'd caution us against using last year's fiscal year return in looking at the values. But we might be able to use some others in looking at that. On the next bonds, I'm curious, those are callable in 23. So the two questions I have, do you have the interest rates that we pay on that as we compare various debt? And also, as we have money currently, do we hold that in cash until those call dates are here and we pay off in 23? And just a little on how that would work.
Thank you, Mr. Representative. I don't have the interest rate right in front of me. I thought I did. Oh, I do. It is 5% on one, both about 5% is the interest rate. I think I understood your other question. They are callable in fiscal 23. Our plan would be to appropriate the money in fiscal 22 to go into an escrow and then also pay for legal defeasance of the debt. So the money will go into escrow in fiscal 22. They won't be called until they're called in fiscal 23. But if we get a legal opinion that says, yes, this is legally defeased, it eliminates it from the state's debt load right away.
Thank you. And a couple of more, if I may continue.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There is one callable bond on the KDOT side. Would we deal with that potentially in the State Highway Fund, or would that be a separate issue?
We didn't discuss any of those. We were really looking at SGF and what we could do here.
And then as we looked to the next item, and while I don't necessarily know if I agree exactly with the projects and the amount, the idea of paying that off is also of interest. And to that end, on your estimate, what interest rate were you using as your bonding estimate rate?
Are you talking about on page 9, the debt avoidance?
Correct.
I used 3% 30-year level pay. I just did a simple amortization.
Okay, 3% 30-year. Thank you for that.
I'd be happy to share my spreadsheet if you want to fact check it.
I'm sure I needn't fact check it. I was just curious the relative assumptions and how we set our priorities for paying off debt. So that's very helpful. Thank you. Excited about the housing thing, as was mentioned, and would be curious at some point as we discuss how that's deployed with existing programs being expanded or new programs and where that goes. So. And then on the very end, thank you for the outlook, not only in 22, but 23, and was trying to get just an idea in general. While our ending balance is then shrinking between those 2 years, I assume it's largely those one-time expenses. And as we look to 24, without those expenses and with the projections, do we expect that ending balance to again stabilize? Or what is the trend as that continues?
Yeah, and we don't have it on here, and it's because we don't know what 23 is going to finalize at yet, right? But if we assume 23 and carry it forward, again, we're structurally balanced in 23. If you exclude the one-time expenditures, which I've got the one-time expenditures at the very bottom of page 29, so you take those out of the expenses and then carry the rest forward. So we're $13 million structurally balanced in '23. That number should continue into '24. I don't have any concerns with the ending balance in '24 with everything that we have loaded in here.
So, thank you. And then the debt avoidance in '23 is what we were just discussing as a potential against those projects, and the debt reduction is the bonds that we would allocate in '22 but retire in '23. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, we have Senator Petty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Adam, I was just wondering, when I looked at on the closing the bank of KDOT, and then you have listed there the debt service, is that debt service, does that encompass any of the debt service that we would be saving from those, if those projects are paid off?
Is your question, are the bonds that we're paying off any of the debt service in highway fund? No, they are not. They're separate bonds. So that debt service that's currently paid by the highway fund, it will continue, but it'll be paid by the state general fund.
Thank you.
Next, we have Representative Wolfmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for presenting today, Adam. I have a couple quick questions. First of all, on the food, I'll try and go quickly, on the food sales tax, you did say that that is not taking the locals portion. We're leaving that intact, correct?
Correct. There will be zero impact to the locals and their ability to assess taxes on food with the plan that is out there.
I think that's important. We don't want to spend their money. So my second question, so that on the highway fund and the CIF money that you're taking the mental health money out of right now, that does not represent a cut to that. You're just transferring those to SGF. So in no way is that a cut, correct?
Thank you very much for the clarification. Zero cuts to the mental health services or those programs. We will just fund those 100% with SGF now instead of the other funding sources. So KDADs will just see a different budget unit that the money goes into. They can still pay for those programs.
Okay. And then my last Medicaid expansion. So I'd kind of forgotten how the 5% works. So first of all, how long is that deal available to us, or do we know?
It's once a state expands and implements Medicaid expansion, you have 8 quarters of the additional 5 percentage point FMAP on the base Medicaid population.
I was asking how long is it available to even take them up on that offer?
Gotcha. Currently, I don't believe there is an end date, but with a mid-year election cycle, who knows what would change with the existing ARPA regulations.
So just to make sure I understand this, so this is 5% increase on the base population.
Correct.
And that represents, you said 370 to 400 million over those 8 quarters. And so if we wanted to capture that money, and we're saying Medicaid expansion costs about 40 million a year, you could essentially pay for 10 years of almost 10 years of Medicaid expansion.
If that was the direction somebody wanted to go, yes, I don't think that's the governor's plan, but yeah, if somebody said, how much is that? It's about 7 to 10 years worth of funding for the expansion program is the benefit the state would get.
And you get 150,000 citizens covered. You get the economic, and this is not even including the economic development.
Correct.
That would obviously result from having 150 people seeing a provider now and having health insurance.
Yeah, the impact to the rural hospitals and even the urban hospitals, candidly, is going to be immense. That is not captured in here. None of the economic impacts are captured in that fiscal note.
Wow. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, we have Representative Humphreys.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. Really helpful. I have 2 questions. One is the debt avoidance, and it has to do with the docking and the new KDHE lab. So some of the urgency of the committee to recommend what we do with that was the federal funding, because we know that's a short period of time and it's a one-time. So do you know where we're at, where we are at with that? You say we're going to seek that to offset those funds, but where are we with that?
Yeah, so I'm kind of speaking for Secretary Burns-Wallace here, but she's reminded me many times that we need to see the final project design before they can determine the exact amount of federal funds available, because it's contingent upon how the building design is. They have said consistently over time that about 50% of the cost of those programs should be allowable by the feds. So I actually sent her a letter at the end of December asking her to encumber 50% of this total money from the state's discretionary funds. So we're holding back $90 million of the federal money right now. So if that is the final number, the 90 million, the governor would come behind this with a GBA reducing SGF by $90 million for that.
Okay, that's great. And just one more question. I know you focused on long-term benefits without long-term funding obligations, and that's great. Certainly, I would agree with that. But I'm playing a little bit off of Representative Johnson's question. I would like a little more clarity on, I mean, certainly we know there's not just one-time funding increases, and I mean, there's not just one-time funding here. There's also increases in mental health and education, 5% pay increase for state employees. Is there a way to break out what's one-time, what's ongoing?
Yeah.
Yep, show me where it is and help me understand.
If you go to page 29, and I can do a better job of showing the actual numbers, but on page 29, on the very bottom right, like literally the very bottom right number, we're showing in fiscal 23, $479.1 million of one-time expenditures. So what I would do, and I'll make this a little bit more visually appealing, I'm just going to take the total expenditures, which is a few lines above that, of $8.9 billion, 8907, about 4 lines up.
Yep.
And I'll just minus out the 479, and that'll tell you what our base is for fiscal 23. That's what we would carry forward into 24 as our current state of 24 expenditures.
And what is the increase from the year before? I mean, just so I understand.
Sure. Do you mind if I clean this up and make a different spreadsheet?
That would be great.
And I'll get it to
really
you in the next
appreciate
2 days, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next, we have Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Prophet, I enjoyed this a whole lot more than I thought I was going to. There's some good stuff in here. Well, okay, yeah, it was you. I'll fess up. Now, there are a couple of questions though that come to mind, and one being, I know this isn't a large amount of money, but we had 81.9 million in the rainy day fund, and now it says we have 0. Where did that go and how did it get there?
Yep. So if we take ourselves all the way back to the summer of 2020, the governor had an allotment plan because there was the April revenue forecast at the bottom just dropped out. That's when the pandemic started, right? As part of the allotment plan, it called for pulling the budget stabilization fund back into the SGF.
Okay.
So last year's governor's budget recommendation had in there pulled $81.9 million into the SGF and don't do the statutory transfer into the budget stabilization fund at the end of the year. That was the starting point.
Gotcha.
As it worked through session, it just didn't make its way back out. You know, we didn't recommend to take it back out. The legislature didn't recommend to take it back out. So that stayed in there in the final budget bill. So on July 1st, the final budget bill said transfer that money to the SGF, and that's where it went.
Okay, very good. That does answer that question. All right. Kind of hinging off, I thought Senator Petty was going to be taking my question here regarding the debt service, the $16 million that is currently a transfer to Department of Administration. And I'm doing this from memory here, and I've slept since last session. It seems like we discussed debt service in Department of Administration and how they were servicing Department of Transportation debt. Am I mistaken on that? Because it seemed like a reasonable transfer to me when it was explained to me at that time.
I don't recall that exact conversation, so I'll start there.
Right. Oh, I don't think you were in that conversation,
Okay.
so that's fair.
My point, our point is that whether it's serviced by D of A or serviced by whomever, it's funded by the highway fund. This particular bond doesn't really have highway projects in it. It's really general state expenditure projects that have been refunded into this bond. So instead of paying for general operating bonding with the highway dollars, let's pay for it with SGF. That was the intent.
And I like the sound of it. I just wanted to make sure that that wasn't a transportation-related bond that we were servicing through Department of Administration, thus making it a reasonable transfer.
We will do a follow-up on that to ensure. I've got the papers from KDFA. It would take me a minute to get through. Let me call them, make sure that I've got my ducks in a row, and I will shoot you an email in the next 2 days.
Perfect, perfect. And if I have one more question, if you don't mind.
Yes, quickly, we're another meeting due in here at 12, so.
Oh, okay, very good. This is actually a compound. I'm going to make it a compound question. First off, stab vests, didn't we approve that last year? For
I don't recall, to be
KDOC?
honest. I'll have to go back and
It
check.
seemed like we did, but like I said, I've slept since then. But as far as transferring the employees from corrections to KPNF retirement plan, we looked at that last year. There were some issues dealing with retirement ages and I think rates being paid also. Do we have are you suggesting mechanics for that to make that more of a smooth transition? Or are we just left to try to figure that out ourselves?
That one will work its way through the committee process. It's going to require a separate bill to facilitate it. In the budget, we appropriated $10 million to the State Finance Council, actually, just to make sure the money was stashed away. We'll introduce the bill and make sure that we work with all the interested parties to ensure that we have everything captured. We'll work certainly with Capers and the team to ensure that the cost that we end up with at the end is what we anticipated, and then move it through and have a partnership on that.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Hawk?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be quick. I wanted to thank you for this budget presentation and the understandable format and the presentations you made to our Joint Budget Committee in the off-season. And I also want to support our Joint Budget Chair, Representative Waymaster, and his comments about thinking that you heard many of the suggestions that we had made through that Joint Budget Committee. I want to make sure I heard you right on, we had a presentation, I think it was the last Budget Committee, from KDFA, which looked at what some of the early debt retirement options might be. Not all of them made sense, but several of them did, and it looks to me like you have those in this budget, and I just wanted to be sure I heard that right.
Yes, sir. We worked with KDFA, and they are always kind enough to at least provide suggestions. That's not mandates, just suggestions on what would or would not make good fiscal sense. The call provisions on these two particular bonds make them more fiscally appealing to the state to use these two as the ones that go after, both the call date and the call provisions.
So, good. That is good to know, and I think that's a joint concern all of us have in the legislature to make sure that we look at our debt. So, thank you for doing that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Kincannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Adam, for your presentation. I'll be real quick. The extended Medicaid coverage from 2 months to 12 months postpartum, I'm sorry if you said this before, do we have a fiscal note on that or an estimate?
We think it's $12 million, all funds for a full year. And I'll verify that to make sure.
So I've been a lot of hearings and meetings that other states are doing this and how important it is. So I'm supportive of the concept. So that's with our regular FMAP then, correct, the 12 million. So if we did expand Medicaid, this wouldn't be necessary because they would be covered anyway and then it would be at the higher FMAP.
Correct. I'd prefer you run all those details through Director Fertig with Medicaid, but yes, pregnant women up to 138, and we discussed this ad nauseum 2 years ago. The current coverage limit for covering pregnant women is they can make up to 171% of FPL. The income threshold for expansion is lower than that at 138% of FPL. So there's a group from 138 to 171 that would still benefit. From 138 down, those would be on the expansion population.
So it would actually cover more than expansion would, so it still would be necessary, but it would be at the improved FMAP.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too will be quick. I had several questions, but Representative Wolfmore asked the ones I was going to ask on mental health and the food and how it affects the local organizations. I would like to make a comment that you have on slide 10, eliminate the practice of delaying K through 12 payments, use current year funds to pay for current expenses. That's one that I've heard, and having served on the school board for 8 years, that's one that I know school districts have really wanted us to pay on time, and I'm glad that that's stated. On slide 12, for Children's Initiative Fund, okay, it's based on Children's Cabinet priorities, and you're going to keep money in the Children's Initiative Fund and the rest from SGF. Would you expand on that a little bit? Because I know people have been able to go in and take a little bit here and a little bit there. Would you explain that?
Sure, yeah. The big one is the transfer to KDADS for mental health, and I don't remember the number, but it's in the neighborhood of $4 or $5 million. We're going to shift that to completely SGF funding, which frees up $4 or $5 million with the CIF. There's a couple of smaller projects that would go to DCF and to KDHE. Those agencies have identified they can actually cover those with existing resources, so the programs will stay. They'll just be funded by the agency that administers the program, again, freeing up additional funds for the CIF, or the Children's Cabinet, to do things with the CIF.
I was hoping that's what you were going to say. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Estes.
You mentioned there were 4 programs funded by the vehicle. What are they? Or did they get moved somewhere else? Did anybody look at whether or not we should keep them?
Yes, very good question. Thank you. At the bottom of slide 13, there's a table there that identifies the 4. The first one is easy. $10 million is going to the highway fund. That just goes away. Again, they get a net positive still, the highway fund. KDADS, there's a $9.7 million transfer for mental health grants. Again, we will give KDADS $9.7 million of SGF, and we do feel strongly they still need that. Adjutant General for emergency communications funds, feel like they need that $320,000. And then debt service was the other one, so yeah, we need to pay the debts. Sure.
Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure that the $15 million or $16 million debt service, you were going to let us know what that debt was? Is that what you said you would? Okay, just
Yes,
want.
sir. I'll make sure you know exactly what it is.
Okay, thank you.
That's the list, Adam.
That's it.
Thank you a lot for being here today, and like I said, you did a very good presentation. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, appreciate it.
We are adjourned.